My name is Julian Vance, I'm 42, and for 7 years, I lived under the delusion that my quiet life as an archivist was anchored by a devoted marriage. But everything shattered last Tuesday in the dusty silence of my library's restricted archive. I walked in just as Sebastian, my wife's business partner, carelessly tossed his gold watch onto my restoration table, a trivial, arrogant act that triggered an irreversible chain reaction. What did I find when I finally hacked their encrypted servers? A $40 million offshore embezzlement scheme, a hidden camera in my own bedroom, and a blueprint to frame me. In just 72 hours, my entire world collapsed. And Clara, the mastermind? She's currently sipping chamomile tea in her floral robe, utterly clueless that the countdown to her ruin has already reached 0. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. The transition from passive observation to active orchestration required a cold, calculated precision that Julian Vance had not utilized in over a decade. In the quiet sanctuary of his private study, illuminated only by the pale blue glow of 3 high-resolution monitors, the harmless, dusty archivist dissolved completely. In his place sat the formidable cybersecurity architect who had once navigated the dark web and moved millions of dollars across the digital ether without leaving a single trace. His first task was to map the intricate financial labyrinth that Marcus, Sebastian, and Pierce had constructed around Clara's art gallery. It was a sophisticated web of shell companies, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and highly inflated art valuations, but to Julian, the structure was elementary. He spent several sleepless nights tracing the digital breadcrumbs, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a silent, rhythmic intensity that contrasted sharply with the slow, deliberate pace of his daytime restoration work. He watched the flow of illicit capital move from Pierce's hedge fund through Sebastian's Shem auctions, finally being washed clean in Marcus's inventory books. They thought they were invisible, shielded by their wealth, social standing, and the sheer complexity of their transactions, but they had left a trail of digital grease that Julian followed with ease. With surgical precision, Julian began to clone their encrypted accounts. He did not merely watch their crimes, he intervened in them. He created a secure, hidden escrow account under a dormant corporation he had established years ago, and with a series of complex keystrokes, he began to reroute small, imperceptible percentages of their transactions. Over the course of 3 weeks, these fractions accumulated into a staggering sum of nearly $40 million. To make the trap inescapable, Julian altered the metadata of the transfers, making it appear as though Marcus was stealing from Pierce, Pierce was squeezing out Sebastian, and Sebastian was secretly draining the gallery's primary reserves. He created a digital Mexican standoff, a web of mutual suspicion that would detonate the moment anyone looked closely. While his digital trap tightened, Julian maintained his role as the quiet, supportive husband at home. When Clara announced her plans to host a massive charity gala at the gallery, an event designed to solidify her position as the city's premier cultural authority, Julian saw the perfect stage for his final act. Over dinner one evening, as she stressed over the budget and the technical limitations of the gallery's outdated projection systems, Julian reached across the table and gently took her hand, his expression a mask of perfect, loving concern. He offered to personally sponsor the entire digital media presentation, hiring a top-tier production crew and providing state-of-the-art high-definition projectors. Clara was overwhelmed with gratitude, her eyes shining as she kissed him, praising his generosity and calling him her anchor. She immediately called Marcus and Sebastian to boast about her husband's unexpected contribution, laughing at how easily he was managed and how blind he was to their activities. Julian merely smiled, accepting her affection with the calm composure of a man who knew he was building her scaffold. In the days leading up to the gala, Julian personally supervised the installation of the new media servers at the gallery, working alongside the technicians who assumed he was just an overeager sponsor. Under the guise of testing the resolution and color calibration, he integrated his proprietary software into the main feed, giving him absolute, encrypted control over every screen and speaker in the building from his personal device. He watched Clara, Marcus, Sebastian, and Pierce walk through the gallery, laughing and drinking expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that every step they took was being monitored, and every word they spoke was being recorded. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the web was spun so tightly that even the slightest movement would trigger their complete and utter ruin. The clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, its slow, heavy strikes echoing through the quiet brownstone as Julian Vance finalized the digital architecture of his trap. He had successfully cloned the offshore accounts, but a final, formidable barrier remained. To authorize the massive transfer of $40 million from the gallery's primary vault, he required a physical cryptographic key. This key was disguised as a bespoke platinum pendant, a lavish gift from Pierce that Clara wore constantly, believing it to be nothing more than an exquisite piece of high jewelry. Julian knew that without cloning the digital signature embedded in that pendant, his financial trap would remain incomplete. He sat in the darkness of his study, listening to the soft rustle of silk upstairs, knowing that the opportunity to retrieve the token would require a delicate, high-stakes performance. When Julian entered the bedroom, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and expensive French perfume. Clara was standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the distant lights of the city. She was visibly tense, the immense pressure of the upcoming gala and the shifting dynamics of her secret alliances weighing heavily on her. As Julian approached, she turned to him, her emerald eyes searching his face. There was a new, indefinable aura of confidence around him that she could not quite comprehend, and it drew her in with an unexpected intensity. She stepped into his space, her fingers tracing the lapel of his shirt, seeking a distraction from the anxiety that consumed her. Julian did not pull away. Instead, he met her gaze with a calm, dark intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The physical connection that followed was fueled by a volatile mix of deception and desire. Clara pressed herself against him, her movements urgent and demanding, desperate to reassert her control over the man she had so casually dismissed as predictable. Julian wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as they moved toward the bed. Every touch was highly charged, a silent battle of wills disguised as passion. As his lips traced the line of her throat, his fingers moved with absolute precision to the clasp of the platinum pendant resting against her collarbone. The contrast was sharp. While Clara was lost in the feverish intensity of the embrace, Julian remained entirely lucid, his senses split between the warmth of her skin and the cold metal of the clasp. With the practiced dexterity of a master restorer, he unlatched the necklace, slipping it silently beneath the pillow as their passion reached its peak. For Clara, the encounter was a thrilling confirmation of her power over him. For Julian, it was the definitive turning point that sealed her fate. An hour later, as Clara slept deeply in the quiet aftermath of their intimacy, Julian slipped out of bed. He retrieved the pendant from beneath the pillow and carried it down to his dark study. Working quickly under the single beam of a desk lamp, he connected the platinum piece to his specialized cloning drive. The progress bar on his monitor crept forward, copying the complex cryptographic algorithms that secured the gallery's millions. Within 15 minutes, the process was complete. Julian executed the script, routing the $40 million into his secure escrow account and leaving a flawless digital trail that implicated Marcus, Sebastian, and Pierce in a mutual web of embezzlement. He carefully returned to the bedroom, placing the necklace back on the nightstand beside her sleeping form. The final piece of the puzzle was in place, and the countdown to the gala had begun. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally descended upon Boston, slicking the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill and casting a shimmering, reflective lacquer over the brick facades. Outside the Clara Vance Gallery of Contemporary Art, a fleet of black town cars and luxury sedans idle along the curb, their exhaust plumes rising like ghosts into the cold autumn air. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast of warmth, light, and calculated opulence. The Grand Exhibition Hall was a masterpiece of minimalist architecture, with soaring white walls, polished concrete floors, and vaulted glass ceilings that now rattled softly under the steady drumbeat of the storm. Hundreds of Boston's most influential figures, old-money philanthropists, prominent politicians, sharp-eyed art critics, and wealthy investors, mingled beneath the massive, state-of-the-art digital projection screens that Julian Vance had personally paid to install. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements, heavy French perfumes, and the faint, metallic tang of chilled champagne being poured into thousands of crystal flutes. Clara Vance stood near the center of the room, a radiant sun around which the evening's elite orbited. She wore a stunning emerald green silk gown that clung perfectly to her figure, the fabric catching the light with every elegant gesture of her hands. Restoring her confidence after the anxiety of the past few weeks, she held court with an effortless, practiced grace. Around her neck, resting prominently against her pale collarbone, was the platinum cryptographic pendant that Pierce had gifted her. She had found it on her nightstand the morning after her intense encounter with Julian, assuming she had simply misplaced it in her passion or that her quiet, doting husband had carefully placed it there to surprise her. She felt untouchable, flanked on either side by the three men who believed they owned her, and who in turn believed they owned the very ground they stood upon. To her left stood Marcus, the gallery's primary art dealer, his silver hair perfectly coiffed and his tailored tuxedo draped over his broad shoulders with the ease of a man accustomed to absolute authority. Beside him was Sebastian, the auctioneer, whose sharp, predatory eyes scanned the crowd with a restless, charismatic energy, his hand occasionally brushing against his jacket where his custom-made Italian watch glinted under the spotlights. And slightly behind them, sipping a neat bourbon, was Pierce, the hedge fund manager whose cold, calculating demeanor always commanded a respectful distance from the other guests. They whispered among themselves, exchanging quiet jokes and knowing glances, secure in the knowledge that the charity gala was not only a triumph of social climbing but also the perfect cover for the massive financial restructuring they had finalized over the past month. Julian Vance watched them from the shadow of the elevated media mezzanine, a glass of sparkling water untouched in his hand. To anyone who glanced up, he appeared to be nothing more than the supportive, slightly awkward husband, a quiet academic who had generously funded his wife's grand vision but preferred to remain in the background. But beneath his calm, unassuming exterior, Julian was entirely focused. His eyes tracked every movement of the four conspirators, his mind executing a complex countdown. In his jacket pocket, his fingers rested on the cool metal casing of his modified mobile device, which was connected via an encrypted, high-bandwidth wireless network to the gallery's main media servers. He had spent the last 48 hours verifying every line of code, ensuring that his proprietary software had completely bypassed the building's standard firewalls and taken absolute control over the entire digital infrastructure. The hum of conversation in the gallery grew louder as the hour approached 8 o'clock. Clara glanced up at the media mezzanine, catching Julian's eye and offering him a brief, dazzling smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the smile she reserved for her followers, for her sponsors, for the people she manipulated to maintain her lifestyle. Julian returned the gesture with a polite, deferential nod, playing his role to perfection. He watched as she whispered something to Marcus, who nodded approvingly and signaled to the catering staff to begin clearing the floor for the presentation. The guests began to migrate toward the center of the exhibition hall, their faces upturned toward the massive projection screens that hung from the steel rafters like silent, white monoliths. Clara walked gracefully toward the raised mahogany stage at the far end of the hall, her emerald gown whispering against the polished concrete. She stepped up to the microphone, the spotlight catching the fine gold threads woven into her hair. As she stood there, the epitome of success and sophistication, the room fell into an expectant silence. She cleared her throat, her voice projecting through the state-of-the-art sound system with a clear, melodic resonance that Julian had personally calibrated. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Clara began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, lingering for a fraction of a second on Pierce and Sebastian. "Tonight is not merely a celebration of the beautiful acquisitions we have brought to Boston, but a testament to the power of community, art, and authenticity. In a world that is increasingly digital and disconnected, we strive to preserve the tangible, the real, and the beautiful. This gallery has always been a sanctuary for those who appreciate the finer details of human expression, and with the generous support of our sponsors, most notably my wonderful husband, Julian, we are embarking on a new era of cultural enrichment." A polite round of applause rippled through the crowd. Julian stood motionless in the shadows, his thumb resting on the activation button of his mobile device. He watched as Clara turned slightly, gesturing toward the massive screens behind her. "To show you the future of our collection, we have prepared a special digital showcase, Clara continued, her smile widening. A journey through the rare prints and contemporary masterpieces that will define our gallery for the next decade. Please, enjoy. She stepped back from the microphone, joining Marcus, Sebastian, and Pierce at the foot of the stage. The lights in the exhibition hall began to dim, plunging the crowd into a warm, intimate twilight. The massive projection screens flickered, transitioning from a static gallery logo to a deep, velvety black. The crowd waited, their faces illuminated by the soft, ambient glow of the displays. But instead of the abstract expressionist paintings or the 19th-century landscapes they expected, the screens remained black for 3 long seconds. Then, a low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the high-end speakers, a sound that felt less like music and more like a warning. The blackness on the screens was suddenly replaced by a high-definition, split-screen video feed. The clarity was startling, the colors rich and deep, captured by the military-grade lens Julian had hidden in the restricted archive room of the library. The left side of the screen showed the interior of the historic archive, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light that illuminated the antique restoration table. The crowd watched, a collective murmur of confusion rising from the floor, as Clara and Sebastian entered the frame. The audio was crystal clear, bypassing the gallery's standard volume limiters to deliver their voices with an intimate, devastating proximity. "Are you sure Julian won't come back early?" Clara's voice echoed through the hall, breathless and laced with an excitement that everyone in the room recognized. Sebastian's laugh followed, low and mocking. "That dusty old academic. He's probably buried under a pile of centuries-old paper. He doesn't have the courage to look up, let alone walk in on us." The confusion in the exhibition hall instantly curdled into a suffocating, horrified silence. No one moved. No one breathed. On the screens, the physical encounter began, raw, intense, and captured in excruciating detail against the very table Julian used for his preservation work. The raw passion of their betrayal was displayed for all of Boston's elite to see, stripped of any artistic pretense, leaving only the ugly, undeniable truth. Before anyone could scream or turn away, the right side of the screen flickered, displaying a complex financial ledger. Bright red lines highlighted names, routing numbers, and transaction histories. The names of Marcus, Sebastian, and Pierce were displayed in bold, clear lettering alongside the details of their offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Underneath, a live counter tracked the movement of $40 million, showing exactly how the funds had been systematically drained from the gallery's primary reserves and routed into a secure, encrypted escrow account. The audio transitioned from the breathless whispers of the archive to a recorded phone conversation between Marcus and Pierce. "Julian's credentials are perfect for this," Pierce's voice boomed through the speakers, cold and entirely devoid of empathy. "If the federal regulators ever look into these accounts, the digital trail points directly to his old cybersecurity firm. He's a quiet, trusting fool. He'll take the fall, and will walk away with $40 million in clean capital." "The man empties his soul into old books for a living," Marcus's voice replied, chuckling. "He's not exactly a criminal mastermind. He won't even realize the money is gone until he's sitting in a deposition." The gallery erupted into absolute pandemonium. The silence was shattered by gasps of horror, sharp cries of disbelief, and the frantic clatter of champagne flutes falling onto the concrete floor. The journalists in the room, realizing they were witnessing the social and financial scandal of the decade, immediately raised their cameras, the flashbulbs firing in a rapid, blinding cadence that illuminated the chaos. Clara stood frozen at the foot of the stage, her face completely drained of color, her eyes wide with a terror so profound that she looked like a ghost in her emerald gown. She clutched the platinum pendant at her throat, her knuckles white, finally realizing what Julian had done while she slept. Beside her, Sebastian's charismatic smile had vanished, replaced by a hollow, slack-jawed shock as he stared at the footage of himself on the screen. Marcus was trembling with rage, his face turning a deep, dangerous crimson, while Pierce, the cold hedge fund manager, frantically pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he tried to call his security team. "Shut it off. Marcus roared, turning toward the media mezzanine, his voice cracking with desperation. "Shut the damn screens off." He lunged toward the stairs leading to the mezzanine, but the crowd of panicked guests blocked his path, creating a bottleneck of shouting bodies. Sebastian tried to follow, but he was instantly surrounded by a group of prominent board members demanding explanations for the financial fraud displayed on the screens. Julian Vance stepped out from the shadows of the mezzanine, walking slowly to the railing. He looked down at the chaos below, his expression entirely calm, almost serene. He held the mobile device in his hand, the screen displaying the status of the broadcast, 100% complete. He had not merely exposed their betrayal, he had delivered it to them on the very stage they had built to celebrate their superiority. "You did this," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring crowd, but her eyes locked onto Julian's calm gaze. "You really did this." Julian did not answer. He simply watched as the digital evidence continued to loop on the massive screens, the voices of his betrayers echoing through the hall, a relentless, inescapable monument to their own greed and arrogance. The web had not only been spun, it had collapsed upon them, and there was no escape from the ruin they had so carefully earned. The echoes of the incriminating audio recordings continued to bounce off the white, minimalist walls of the gallery, filling the high-ceilinged room with a suffocating, inescapable weight. The initial shock that had silenced the crowd of Boston's elite slowly dissolved into a chaotic, murmuring sea of whispers, gasps, and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of camera shutters. The journalists, who had arrived expecting a routine evening of high-society philanthropy, now realized they were holding the front-page story of the year. Their flashbulbs flared continuously, casting harsh, ghostly shadows across the panicked faces of the four conspirators standing near the stage. The emerald silk of Clara's gown, which had seemed so vibrant and triumphant only minutes earlier, now looked like a cold, glittering shroud under the unforgiving glare of the spotlights. Beside her, the fragile alliance between Marcus, Sebastian, and Pierce began to disintegrate in real time, precisely as Julian had designed. Because Julian had altered the metadata of the cloned accounts to make it appear as though the three men were actively embezzling from one another, the sudden exposure of the financial ledger triggered an immediate, volatile reaction. Marcus, his face a dangerous shade of crimson, turned violently toward Sebastian. The silver-haired art dealer grabbed the younger auctioneer by the lapel of his tailored tuxedo, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "You bastard," Marcus roared, his breath smelling of expensive champagne and raw panic. "You were draining the primary reserves behind my back. I knew you were greedy, Sebastian, but $40 million. You ruined us for $40 million. Sebastian, his usual charismatic swagger completely gone, tried to wrench himself free from Marcus's grip, his eyes darting frantically toward the massive screens that still displayed his face in the restricted library archive. "It wasn't me, Marcus. Look at the ledger. It shows the routing numbers originating from Pierce's hedge fund. Pierce was the one squeezing us out. Pierce did not join the physical altercation. Instead, the hedge fund manager stood perfectly still, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on the red lines of the digital ledger. He was a man who dealt in risk and probability, and he could see the mathematical perfection of the trap. The digital trail was flawless, linking their legitimate accounts to offshore shell companies in a way that defied simple explanation. He looked up from the screen, his gaze moving slowly past the shouting crowd, past the weeping Clara, until it landed on the elevated media mezzanine. There, standing quietly at the railing, was Julian Vance. The quiet, unassuming archivist who emptied trash cans of history for a living was looking down at them with an expression of absolute, serene detachment. Julian's hands were resting lightly on the polished wood of the railing, his thumb occasionally tapping the screen of his mobile device. He did not look angry, he did not look triumphant. He looked like a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. As the realization swept through the room, the crowd of guests began to part, their eyes following Pierce's gaze up to the mezzanine. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the exhibition hall, broken only by the quiet sob of Clara, who had collapsed onto the steps of the mahogany stage. She looked up at her husband, her perfect makeup ruined by tears, her fingers still desperately clutching the platinum pendant at her throat. "Julian," she whispered, her voice carrying through the quiet room. "Julian, please. This is a mistake. It's a misunderstanding. You have to believe me." Julian did not answer immediately. He walked slowly down the spiral staircase of the mezzanine, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished concrete. The crowd of wealthy patrons, politicians, and critics stepped back as he approached, giving him a wide, respectful berth. He was no longer the invisible husband, the quiet academic who stood in the corner nursing a warm beer. He was the center of gravity in the room. He stopped a few feet from the stage, looking down at Clara. The contrast between them was absolute. She was a ruined monument of vanity and deceit, while he was the embodiment of quiet, unyielding truth. "There is no mistake, Clara," Julian said, his voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of hatred. "I have spent the past several months verifying every detail of your activities. I have listened to your conversations, tracked your digital footprint, and watched you plan my financial and social ruin with the men you chose to share your life with. I simply decided to give you the transparency you always claimed to value." Marcus let go of Sebastian's lapel, his chest heaving as he glared at Julian. "You think you've won, Vance? This is illegal surveillance. You've hacked into private servers, you've stolen proprietary financial data, and you've displayed it without consent. We will sue you into the ground. You'll spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary." Julian turned his gaze to Marcus, his expression untroubled. The digital data displayed on these screens was retrieved from servers owned by the Clara Vance Gallery, an entity of which I am a primary legal partner. The security protocols were bypassed using administrative credentials that were legally mine to use. As for the $40 million, Marcus, it has not been stolen. It has been secured in an escrow account, awaiting the inevitable investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I have already sent the complete, unedited files to their forensic division. At the mention of the federal regulators, the last remnants of Pierce's composure vanished. He knew that once the government began digging into those accounts, they would find not only the $40 million Julian had routed, but also the years of systematic money laundering and tax evasion that had funded their luxurious lifestyles. His entire empire, built on borrowed capital and political influence, was about to collapse. In the distance, the faint, wailing sound of sirens began to pierce the heavy drumbeat of the rain outside. The sound grew louder, closer, the high-pitched screams of police cruisers and federal vehicles echoing through the wet streets of Beacon Hill. The flashing blue and red lights began to paint the glass ceiling of the gallery, casting a chaotic, pulsing glow over the terrified faces of the guests. The double doors of the gallery were thrown open, and a team of federal agents and Boston police officers entered the room, their wet trench coats glistening under the chandeliers. The lead agent, a sharp-faced man with tired eyes, stepped forward, his badge displayed prominently on his lapel. "Nobody move," the agent commanded, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers of the crowd. "We have a warrant for the seizure of the gallery's financial records and the arrest of several individuals named in an ongoing federal investigation." Clara looked at the agents, a desperate, hysterical hope flaring in her eyes. She pointed a trembling finger at Julian. "Him!" she screamed, her voice rising to a shriek. "He did this. He hacked our systems, he stole our money, and he's been spying on us for months. Arrest him." The lead agent looked at Clara, then at Julian, who stood perfectly still, his hands loosely at his sides. The agent reached into his pocket and pulled out his mobile phone, which had begun to vibrate with an urgent, high-priority call. He stepped away from the crowd, his face darkening as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. Julian watched the agent's face, his analytical mind immediately recognizing the subtle shift in the man's demeanor. The calm confidence that had sustained Julian throughout his meticulous planning began to waver, replaced by a cold, creeping sense of unease. He looked at Pierce, who had finally put his phone away and was now watching the lead agent with a slow, smug smile returning to his face. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, Julian realized, the truth was a commodity that could be bought, sold, and rewritten. Pierce's political connections were deeper and more powerful than any digital security protocol he could design. The federal agent finished his call, pocketed his phone, and walked back to the center of the room, his eyes locked onto Julian with a cold, professional indifference. "Julian Vance," the agent said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You are under arrest for corporate espionage, unauthorized access to secure federal financial networks, and the grand theft of $40 million from the escrow accounts of the Clara Vance Gallery." Julian did not move. He did not protest. He simply looked at the handcuffs being pulled from the agent's belt, realizing that the system he had trusted to deliver justice was already turning its heavy, corrupt gears against him. The web he had spun so carefully was about to be torn apart by the very hands he had expected to help him. The concrete walls of the federal holding facility in downtown Boston were painted a pale, institutional gray that seemed designed to absorb both light and hope. For Julian Vance, the transition from the warm, leather-scented quiet of his Beacon Hill brownstone to this sterile, windowless cell had been swift and absolute. The hum of the overhead fluorescent tubes was constant, a high-pitched vibration that rattled against his temple, replacing the gentle ticking of the grandfather clocks he had lived with for so many years. He sat on the narrow steel bunk, his hands clasped between his knees, his analytical mind working with the same quiet precision that had guided him through the archives. He had spent his entire life believing in the absolute nature of systems. In computer science, a line of code was either correct or it was not. In historical preservation, a document was either authentic or a forgery. But in the physical world of power, wealth, and influence, Julian was learning that the system was a fluid, corrupt entity that could be bent and reshaped by those who held the keys. His defense attorney, a weary, sharp-eyed man named Arthur Pendleton, arrived 3 hours later, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. They met in a small, glass-walled interrogation room that offered no privacy from the watchful eyes of the guards outside. Arthur did not offer a handshake. He simply sat down, opened his briefcase, and spread a thick stack of legal documents across the metallic table. "We have a significant problem, Julian," Arthur began, his voice low and raspy. "The prosecution isn't just looking to convict you. They are looking to bury you. The federal government has taken over the case, and they are treating this as a high-level cyber-terrorism and corporate espionage event." Julian looked at the documents, his eyes scanning the charges. Wire fraud, identity theft, unauthorized access to protected financial networks, and the grand theft of $40 million. He looked up at Arthur, his expression remaining entirely calm. "The $40 million is in a secure, transparent escrow account," Julian said, his voice level. "I did not steal it. I moved it to prevent Marcus, Sebastian, and Pierce from laundering it through the gallery's offshore accounts. The transaction logs are clear. The money is untouched." "It doesn't matter," Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "Pierce's attorneys have spent the last 48 hours restructuring the narrative. They have presented evidence to the grand jury showing that the escrow account you created was registered under a shell corporation that you controlled through an offshore trust in Panama. To the federal prosecutors, it looks like you were preparing to flee the country with the funds. They are framing your entire investigation as a highly sophisticated blackmail scheme." "And the recordings?" Julian asked. "The video of Clara and Sebastian? The audio of Marcus and Pierce discussing their tax evasion?" Arthur shook his head, a look of profound frustration passing over his face. "The judge has already ruled the recordings inadmissible in the criminal trial. Because they were captured using hidden surveillance equipment inside a private residence and a private gallery without a warrant, they violate federal wiretapping laws. But it gets worse, Julian. Clara's legal team is preparing a defense that is as brilliant as it is terrifying. They are going to claim the recordings are deepfakes." Julian stared at his attorney, a cold sensation settling in his chest. "Deepfakes?" "Yes," Arthur said. "You are a known cybersecurity expert with a background in advanced digital architecture. They have hired their own forensic analysts who will testify that you used generative artificial intelligence to fabricate the video of Clara and Sebastian, as well as the audio recordings of Marcus and Pierce. They will argue that you created these highly realistic digital forgeries out of jealousy and professional inadequacy, using them to blackmail the gallery owners and destroy your wife's reputation because you couldn't handle her success. The audacity of the strategy was breathtaking. Julian realized that his own expertise, the very skill set that had allowed him to uncover their crimes, was being turned into the weapon that would destroy him. In the eyes of the court, he was no longer the victim of a systematic betrayal. He was a dangerous, obsessive cybercriminal who had used advanced technology to terrorize his wife and her business associates. The trial, which began 3 months later at the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse, was a masterclass in public relations and legal manipulation. The courtroom was packed to capacity every day, filled with the same socialites, journalists, and gallery patrons who had attended the fateful gala. Outside, the gray, misty waters of Boston Harbor visible through the towering glass windows of the courthouse seemed to mirror the bleak, uncertain future that awaited Julian. The prosecution's presentation was relentless. They painted Julian as a cold, calculating stalker who had spent years hiding behind the mask of a harmless librarian while secretly building a vast, illicit digital empire. They presented his offshore accounts, accumulated through his early cryptocurrency investments, as proof of his criminal nature, claiming he had been laundering money long before he met Clara. When Clara took the stand, the courtroom fell into a hushed, sympathetic silence. She wore a conservative, dark gray wool suit that made her look fragile, her usual vibrant energy replaced by a quiet, trembling vulnerability. She carried a lace handkerchief, her eyes red from weeping as she looked toward the jury, carefully avoiding Julian's gaze. "I never suspected anything," Clara sobbed, her voice carrying perfectly through the silent courtroom. "Julian was always so quiet, so supportive. I thought he loved me. But then I started finding the cameras. He had hidden them everywhere. In our bedroom, in my dressing room, even in the private viewing rooms at the gallery. I felt like I was living in a panopticon. I was terrified to speak, terrified to move in my own home." "And the video displayed at the gala, Mrs. Vance?" the prosecutor asked, his voice dripping with theatrical sympathy. "It was a nightmare," Clara whispered, pressing the handkerchief to her eyes. "It wasn't real. It was a horrible, distorted fantasy that he created to humiliate me. Sebastian and I were working on an appraisal. We were professional colleagues. But Julian took our images, our voices, and he twisted them into something disgusting. He wanted to destroy my career, my gallery, everything I had worked so hard to build." Sebastian and Marcus followed her on the stand, their testimonies perfectly aligned with hers. They presented clean, audited financial ledgers that showed the gallery's accounts had been perfectly legitimate until Julian's digital intrusion. They claimed that Julian's hacking had caused irreparable damage to their reputations, forcing the closure of the gallery and the cancellation of dozens of lucrative contracts. Pierce was the final witness for the prosecution. He sat in the witness box with the calm, untouchable confidence of a man who owned the room. He did not look at Julian. He simply explained, in clear, precise financial terms, how Julian had bypassed their security protocols to steal $40 million, framing the transaction as a defensive measure when it was, in reality, a bold attempt to bankrupt his competitors. Julian's defense was systematically dismantled. Every piece of digital evidence he had gathered was challenged, excluded, or painted as a fabrication. Arthur Pendleton fought bravely, pointing out the inconsistencies in the prosecution's financial audits and demanding a deeper investigation into Pierce's offshore transactions, but his objections were repeatedly overruled by the judge. The judge, a man whose career had been quietly funded by political action committees connected to Pierce's hedge fund, showed a clear, unyielding bias toward the prosecution from the very beginning. In his final address to the jury, the prosecutor turned to look directly at Julian, pointing a finger at him with a look of righteous indignation. "This is not a case about a broken marriage," the prosecutor declared, his voice booming through the courtroom. "This is a case about a dangerous, highly intelligent predator who used his immense technical skills to invade the privacy of his wife, blackmail her associates, and steal $40 million. He thought he was smarter than the law. He thought he could hide behind his books and his quiet academic persona while pulling the strings of a massive criminal conspiracy. We must show him, and anyone else who thinks they can weaponize technology, that the truth cannot be hacked. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Julian stood beside Arthur, his posture straight, his expression serene. He looked across the room at Clara, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Marcus and Pierce. She was no longer crying. She looked at him with a cold, triumphant smile, the emerald pendant she had worn to the gala glinting under the lights. The foreperson of the jury stood up, holding the verdict sheet. On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant, Julian Vance, guilty. On the count of unauthorized access to protected financial networks, we find the defendant, Julian Vance, guilty. On the count of grand theft, we find the defendant, Julian Vance, guilty. Each word fell like a heavy, iron blow, sealing Julian's fate. The judge did not hesitate. He ordered Julian to be remanded into custody immediately, scheduling the sentencing hearing for the following week, where he promised to deliver the maximum penalty allowed under federal guidelines, 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. As the marshals stepped forward to reapply the handcuffs, Julian looked back at his betrayers one last time. Clara was already leaning in to whisper something to Pierce, her laughter quiet but unmistakable. Marcus and Sebastian were shaking hands with the prosecutors, their reputations restored and their financial crimes buried forever beneath the weight of Julian's conviction. The system had worked perfectly, but it had not delivered justice. It had simply protected the powerful, leaving Julian to pay the price for the truth he had dared to expose. The steel shackles around Julian Vance's wrists were cold, a sharp and biting contrast to the humid air of the transport van that carried him away from the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse. As the vehicle rattled over the uneven asphalt of the Boston streets, Julian stared out of the small, reinforced grate at the passing city. The historic brick buildings of Beacon Hill, the familiar silhouette of the Boston Athenaeum, and the distant, glittering waters of the harbor all seemed like fragments of a dream from which he had been violently awakened. He was no longer Julian Vance, the respected archivist, the quiet preserver of history, or the wealthy investor who had quietly secured his future in the early days of digital currency. He was now federal inmate number 94,712, bound for the Federal Correctional Institution in Devens, Massachusetts, to begin serving a 15-year sentence for crimes he had not only not committed, but had actively tried to expose. The intake process at the penitentiary was a systematic stripping away of his remaining humanity. He was ordered to stand naked on the cold concrete floor of a sterile holding room while guards in heavy blue uniforms examined him with detached, professional indifference. His civilian clothes, the tailored wool trousers, the soft cotton shirt, the leather shoes he had polished himself, were confiscated, placed in a plastic bag to be stored in a dark vault until a decade and a half had passed. In their place, he was given 2 sets of coarse, oversized orange scrubs, a pair of cheap canvas slip-ons, and a thin, wool blanket that smelled strongly of industrial disinfectant. When the heavy iron door of his cell finally slid shut with a deafening, metallic crash, the sound resonated deep in his chest, a final, absolute punctuation mark on his old life. In the months that followed, Julian's world shrunk to a space that measured exactly 8 feet by 10 feet. The silence here was different from the peaceful, reverent quiet of his beloved library. This silence was heavy, punctuated by the distant, echoing shouts of other inmates, the clatter of metal trays, and the relentless, rhythmic pacing of his own feet on the concrete floor. He spent his hours analyzing the wreckage of his life, his mind running like a diagnostic program over the events of the past year. He realized, with a cold and hollow clarity, that his mistake had not been in his technical execution. His code had been flawless, his surveillance had been absolute, his financial tracking had been mathematically perfect. His mistake had been a fundamental misunderstanding of the world he lived in. He had believed that the truth was an objective, unyielding force that, once revealed, would naturally correct the system. He had not understood that to the ultra-wealthy, the truth was merely a draft of a script that could be rewritten, edited, or completely deleted with enough money and political influence. While Julian adapted to the brutal, monotonous rhythms of prison life, the world outside moved on with a terrifying, indifferent speed. In the prison library, the only sanctuary he could find, Julian quietly monitored the social and financial columns of the newspapers. The contrast between his reality and the lives of his betrayers was a constant, burning source of outrage. A glossy lifestyle magazine featured Clara on its cover, her emerald eyes looking out at the world with a carefully constructed expression of quiet resilience. The headline, printed in elegant, silver lettering, read, "Out of the Shadows, How Clara Vance Reclaimed Her Life and Her Art." The article was a masterpiece of public relations, detailing Clara's courageous survival of what her attorneys termed digital domestic terrorism. She was portrayed as a heroic figure who had stood strong while her obsessive, cybercriminal husband tried to destroy her reputation and steal her gallery's assets. There was no mention of the restricted archive, no mention of Sebastian, and no mention of the systematic betrayal that had started the entire chain of events. The video that Julian had displayed at the gala was dismissed in a single, dismissive paragraph as a highly sophisticated, artificial intelligence-generated forgery, a warning tale of the dangers of modern technology in the hands of a jealous man. The financial recovery of the corrupt trio was even more complete. By order of the federal court, the $40 million that Julian had routed into the secure escrow account was returned to the gallery's primary treasury. But the injustice did not stop there. To satisfy the massive civil judgment that Clara, Marcus, and Pierce had filed against him for reputational damage and business interruption, the government liquidated Julian's personal offshore accounts. His legitimate cryptocurrency fortune, worth over $4 million, which he had accumulated through years of careful, independent investment, was seized and awarded directly to his betrayers as restitution. They had not only escaped the consequences of their financial fraud, they had been handsomely rewarded for it, their wealth nearly doubled by the very man they had ruined. With Julian's money, Clara and Pierce expanded their empire. They opened a massive, state-of-the-art flagship gallery in Chelsea, Manhattan, an event that was attended by the city's political elite and covered extensively by the national art press. Marcus and Sebastian were listed as senior partners, their names cleared and their standing in the art world higher than ever before. They were untouchable, shielded by a wall of wealth and connections that Julian's truth had not even managed to dent. One cold Tuesday afternoon, nearly 6 months into his sentence, Julian was summoned to the visitation room. He was led down a series of long, white corridors, his hands cuffed behind his back, until he reached a small booth divided by a thick sheet of scratched plexiglass. Sitting on the other side, looking immaculate in a tailored cream coat and a silk scarf, was Clara. She looked healthy, vibrant, and completely unburdened by guilt. She did not pick up the telephone receiver immediately, she simply sat and looked at him through the glass, her gaze moving over his shaved head, his faded orange scrubs, and the dark circles beneath his eyes. When she finally lifted the receiver, her voice was clear, cool, and entirely devoid of the emotion she had displayed on the witness stand. "You look tired, Julian," she said, her voice static-heavy through the cheap earpiece. Julian held the receiver to his ear, his expression remaining as calm and unreadable as it had been during his trial. "I am sleeping well enough, Clara. The library here has a decent collection of historical biographies. It keeps my mind occupied." Clara let out a soft, mocking laugh, a sound that brought back a sudden, sharp memory of her voice on the recording in the archive. "Still the librarian," she said, shaking her head. "Still looking backward. You always did prefer the dead to the living, Julian. That was your real problem. You were so busy preserving the past that you didn't notice the present moving right past you." "I noticed," Julian replied quietly. "I noticed everything. I have the recordings to prove it." Clara's smile did not waver. "The recordings? You mean those digital fabrications the court ordered to be destroyed?" "Nobody cares about those, Julian. In our world, a fact is only a fact if people are willing to pay for it. Pierce's attorneys paid a very high price to make sure your facts were classified as fiction. And your crypto? The $4 million you hid from me for 7 years. It funded our new space in New York. We're calling the main exhibition hall the Vance Wing. I thought you'd appreciate the irony. Julian stared at her through the scratched glass, his fingers tightening slightly on the plastic receiver. He could feel the heavy, suffocating weight of the injustice pressing down on him, a physical sensation that made it difficult to breathe. She had taken his freedom, his reputation, his life savings, and the very truth he had sacrificed everything to reveal, and she had used them to build a monument to her own vanity. "Why did you come here, Clara?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "To gloat. I came to bring you the final divorce papers," she said, sliding a manila envelope across the counter on her side of the glass. "The guard will bring them to your cell later. I wanted to look at you one last time, to see if you finally understood. You thought you were a mastermind, Julian. You thought because you could write code and track numbers that you were superior to us. But you're just furniture, remember? You're the quiet, predictable background noise of my life. You played your part, you funded my transition to the next level, and now you're exactly where you belong." She hung up the receiver before he could respond. She stood up, adjusting her silk scarf with a slow, deliberate movement, her fingers brushing against the platinum pendant that still rested against her collarbone. She turned and walked out of the visitation room, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor, leaving Julian alone in the small, gray booth. As the guards led him back to his cell, the handcuffs biting into his wrists with every step, Julian looked up at the small, barred windows that lined the corridor. The sky outside was a heavy, slate gray, promising another long, freezing night of rain. He realized then that there would be no last-minute rescue, no sudden revelation of new evidence, and no justice from a system that was designed to protect the very people who had destroyed him. He had held up a mirror to their corruption, and the world had simply smashed the mirror and locked him away for showing them what they looked like. He was 15 years away from his books, 15 years away from his quiet life, and 15 years away from the truth. He sat down on his narrow steel bunk, pulling the thin, disinfectant-scented blanket around his shoulders, listening to the heavy, final slam of the cell doors echoing down the long, empty hall.